Some debts aren't written in numbers, they're written in names, and mine was signed away before I ever understood what I was worth. The night my uncle decided I was the cleanest solution to a dirty problem, it was raining. Not the kind of rain that washes things clean, the kind that turns everything grey and indistinct, that makes the world look like it's already given up. I remember standing at the kitchen window of his house in Brampton, watching the water collect in the cracked concrete of the driveway, thinking about the number he owed, $47,000. I knew the exact figure because I'd been the one keeping his books for the past 3 years. Unpaid, obviously. That was the arrangement. I kept a roof over my head, and he kept pretending he was doing me a favor. My name is Avery Lund, and I was 26 years old when my uncle handed me over to Casimir Rhone. He didn't call it that, of course. He called it a placement, an arrangement. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with his hands folded, and his jaw set the way it got when he'd already made a decision and was only informing me out of basic courtesy. He said the Rhone organization needed someone to manage internal accounts. Someone clean, no record, no known associations. Someone who could sit in a room and run numbers without asking the wrong questions. He said I was perfect for it. I asked him what he'd get in return. He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. I already knew. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that the man he was selling my skills to had been watching the way I ran those books for 6 months. That Casimir Rhone didn't take on anyone without knowing exactly what they were bringing through his door. That when I walked into the Rhone building in downtown Toronto, 3 days later with a single messenger bag over my shoulder, I wasn't walking into a cage. I was walking into an audition. The building didn't look like what I expected. I'm not sure what I expected. Something obvious, probably. Something that announced itself. What I found instead was a 12-story glass and steel structure in the financial district, with a real estate development company on the lobby directory, and a security desk staffed by a man who looked at me with absolutely no expression and told me to take the elevator to the 9th floor. The 9th floor was quiet. Not the quiet of an empty office, the quiet of controlled space. The carpet absorbed sound. The lighting was cool and deliberate. 2 people moved through the corridor with tablets in their hands and didn't look up as I passed. At the end of the hall, a woman with a sharp grey bob and reading glasses on a chain around her neck was standing outside a closed door. She looked me over the way someone looks at a balance sheet. Quickly, completely, without sentiment. "Miss Lund," she said. Not a question. "Yes, I'm Opal. I manage Mr. Rhone's internal schedule and personnel logistics." She handed me a lanyard with a photo ID already printed on it. My name, my face, a photograph I hadn't taken for them. "You'll be working in the back office on accounts reconciliation to start. Your access is limited to what's on that card. You don't go anywhere your card doesn't open. You don't ask questions about work that isn't yours. You don't discuss anything you see here with anyone outside this building." She paused. "Those aren't suggestions." "Understood," I said. She looked at me for another moment. Then she opened the door. I didn't see Casimir Rhone that day, or the next. For the first 2 weeks I sat in a narrow office with no window, a high-spec laptop, and access to a set of accounts that were disguised with about 4 layers of corporate structuring. The work wasn't difficult, exactly. It was deliberate. Someone had set up these books to be functional but opaque, readable if you knew what you were looking for, incomprehensible if you didn't. I knew what I was looking for. I'd been untangling my uncle's creative accounting since I was 23. I worked. I ate lunch at my desk. I took the subway home to the basement apartment in Parkdale I'd been renting since I was 22, made something simple for dinner, and read until I fell asleep. I didn't call my uncle. He didn't call me. The first time I flagged something, it was a discrepancy in the shell company's quarterly outflows. A small $1,4,200. The kind of thing that only appears if you're actually reading the line items, instead of just checking the totals. I wrote it up, tagged it with a note explaining the likely source, and left it in the shared folder at the end of the day the way Opal had told me to do with completed work. The next morning, there was a new file in my folder. 12 months of additional accounts. Nothing else. No feedback, no acknowledgement. I opened the files and started working. I met Rhone in the 4th week. He came into the back office without knocking, which was not unusual for this building. Privacy seemed to be a courtesy extended only to him. He was taller than I'd expected from the photographs I'd found when I was first trying to understand where I'd ended up. There were photographs online, old ones mostly, grainy, and taken at a distance in the way that suggested the photographer hadn't been especially welcome. In person he was. Precise was the word that came to me. Everything deliberate. The way he stood. The way his eyes moved across the room before they settled on me. He didn't introduce himself. The outflow discrepancy, he said. The 4200, I said. Where did it go? Probably nowhere. It's a compounding error in the reporting template. Whoever set up the formula in the export sheet used a summing range that doesn't account for the sub-ledger entries from the third-party vendor invoices. The money's there. It's just being double-counted downward. I turned the laptop to face him and pointed at the formula bar. If you fix the range here, it resolves automatically. I can do it now if you want, but I wanted to make sure you knew it wasn't an actual loss before I changed anything in the source file. He looked at the screen for a moment. How long did it take you to find it? He asked. About 6 hours. How long has it been there? I hesitated. Approximately 31 months. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like recalibration. He pulled the chair from the other side of the desk. There was another desk in the office, unused, and sat down across from me. Fix it, he said. Then write me a summary of every other template error you've found in the current file set. I have 23 flagged. He looked at me again. That same measuring quality. How many do you expect to find total? In what's been given to me so far? Maybe 40. If there are older files, probably more. He nodded once, stood up, moved toward the door. Opal will give you expanded access tomorrow, he said. Then he walked out. That was the whole conversation. 12 minutes, maybe. I turned back to the laptop and fixed the formula, then pulled up my notes on the other 23 errors and started writing the summary he'd asked for. I didn't think about what it meant that he'd come down himself to ask. I didn't let myself think about it. The expanded access came with a new office. This one had a window. It looked out over the courtyard at the back of the building, which was small and quiet and planted with something low and evergreen that I never learned the name of. There was also a phone with a direct line and a new set of credentials that opened 3 additional floors. The work got heavier, more complex, more real, in ways I tried not to examine too carefully. These weren't shell companies managing real estate. These were the operational finances of something much larger. Logistics, personnel, distribution networks spread across 4 cities. I could see the shape of it in the numbers without ever seeing the details. I was good at that, seeing shapes. I started leaving later. 7 o'clock, then 8, then sometimes past 9. Not because anyone asked me to, because the problems were interesting, which I couldn't entirely forgive myself for, and because the apartment in Parkdale had started to feel very quiet in a way I couldn't fix. Rhone came back to my office twice more in that period. Both times he arrived without announcement, asked a specific question, listened to the answer, and left. He didn't sit down those times. He stood near the door, like he hadn't committed to being there yet. The third time, he brought a file and set it on my desk without preamble. There's a conflict, he said. These 2 properties are being reported under separate cost centers, but the operating expenses are overlapping. I need to know which numbers are real. I opened the file. It was dense. 2 years of quarterly reports, with a level of deliberate structural complexity that felt less like accounting and more like architecture. Someone had spent a lot of time making sure these books could withstand scrutiny. The problem was they hadn't anticipated someone who could read both sets simultaneously and map the overlap. I worked on it for 3 days. I slept at the apartment but barely, and I was back before 7 each morning. On the 3rd afternoon, I put together a clean report and sent it to the shared folder. Then I stared at the window for a while and thought about whether I was going to keep doing this. The problem was that I didn't have an alternative. My uncle's debt was still out there. I had no savings worth mentioning, no family, No one who'd offered me anything other than exactly what I was already getting. And the work itself, was the most interesting thing I'd done in years. That was the part that troubled me, that I was here because I'd been handed over like a ledger entry, and I was still finding it interesting. Rhone came to my office the evening the report was filed. It was past 7. Most of the floor was empty. He read the report standing at my desk while I waited. He had the quality of someone who had taught himself not to show reaction. Not as coldness, exactly, but as discipline. Like he'd decided years ago that his face was only useful when he chose to use it. You separated them, he said. The second property's numbers are real. The first is overstated by about 18%. I flagged the specific line items. I hesitated. The overstatement has been consistent for long enough that it's probably intentional. It is, he said. He didn't elaborate. I didn't ask. That was the protocol I'd built for myself. I answer the questions I'm asked. I don't ask the ones that aren't mine. He set the file down. He looked at me, and it was different from the earlier times, more direct, like he was deciding something. Why haven't you asked about the original arrangement? He said. I took a breath. Because it doesn't change anything yet. Yet the debt my uncle owed you, whatever the terms were. I assume at some point there's a conversation about what happens when it's settled. And until then I do the work, I said. It's the only leverage I have. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere below us, a car alarm started and then stopped. The debt was cleared 2 weeks after you arrived, he said. I felt the floor shift slightly under me, or something that felt like that. I kept my expression neutral. I was good at that too. Why didn't you tell me? I said. Because I wanted to see what you'd do if you thought you had to be here. He picked up the file. And because I hadn't decided yet whether I needed you to stay. Have you decided now? He looked at the file in his hand, then back at me. You'll be moved to the main finance team on Monday, he said. Full integration, not a contractor arrangement. Opal will have the paperwork ready. He left. I sat in the empty office for a long time after that, watching the courtyard go dark. What no one tells you about becoming part of something like the Rhone organization is how slowly it happens. There's no single moment where you cross a line. It's a series of smaller decisions. To stay late, to ask one more clarifying question, to accept the key card that opens the 11th floor. Each one feels contained. Each one makes a kind of sense. And then one morning you realize that you know the names of distribution managers in 3 provinces, and the financial structure of something that doesn't officially exist, and the version of yourself that stood in that Brampton kitchen, watching the rain, feels very far away. I told myself it was practical. I told myself I was building something, savings, skills, a record of work that could eventually be used somewhere legitimate. What I didn't let myself look at directly was the other thing. The thing that happened in the hours I spent in Rhone's office, because he'd started summoning me there instead of coming to mine, where he would walk me through a problem, not because he needed me to solve it, but because, I came to understand, he wanted someone who could follow the logic, someone who wouldn't simplify it to make themselves comfortable. He never talked about himself. He asked questions. About the work, mostly, but sometimes about other things. Why I'd learned to keep books, what I'd done before my uncle's household, whether I'd ever worked in a place that wasn't managing someone else's mess. The questions were direct without being invasive. They left me room to answer without giving more than I wanted to. I started giving more than I wanted to. That was when I understood I was in trouble. The crisis, when it came from outside. There was another organization, based out of Montreal, structured differently, older money and older methods, that had been circling the Toronto operations for 2 years. I knew this from the accounts. I'd seen the strain in the numbers, the unusual cash reserves, the quietly accelerating payments to certain logistics partners that I understood now were insurance of a particular kind. What I didn't know, until Opal appeared in my office doorway at 6 in the morning on a Wednesday with her grey bob perfect, and her face composed in the way it got when something bad had already happened, was that they'd moved. The Lecra network has made contact with 2 of our primary account managers, she said. Both have agreed to cooperate with them. "Which accounts?" she told me. I pulled up my system and started working. 2 of the accounts she named were ones I managed directly. The other 3 I knew tangentially, enough to understand what had been compromised and what hadn't. I worked for 4 hours straight, moving reserves, restructuring exposure, creating paper trails that would make any extraction attempt look like it was hitting empty rooms. Rhone appeared at some point. I was aware of him in the way you're aware of a change in air pressure. But he didn't interrupt. He stood near the window and watched me work. When I finally sat back, my neck ached and I'd gone through 2 cups of coffee that had both gone cold. "The LaCroix people will find accounts," I said, "but they'll be finding accounts that have already been vacated. I've preserved the operational funds and created enough decoy structure to keep them busy for at least 2 weeks. "That's enough time," Rhone said. I turned to look at him. He was watching me with an expression I hadn't seen before, not the usual measured assessment, something quieter, like he was seeing something he'd been waiting to confirm. "You didn't panic," he said. "Panicking doesn't fix the numbers," I said. "No," he said, "it doesn't." He crossed to the desk. He sat down across from me, the same way he had in the first office in those early weeks, and he set his hands flat on the desk, and he looked at me with that directness he reserved for things he'd already decided. "There are people in this organization," he said, "who have been here for years, good at their work, loyal. I don't extend personal trust lightly or often." He paused. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to tell me what you want to do with it." I waited. "The arrangement with your uncle was manufactured," he said. "He didn't come to us. We identified you. He agreed to the framing in exchange for the debt being cleared. You were never collateral. You were recruited." The room was very quiet. "Why the performance?" I said. "Because people who think they have no options make different choices than people who think they have full ones. I needed to know what you were like when you thought you had nothing." He held my gaze. "I'm sorry for that. It was calculating. Everything you do is calculating," I said. "Yes," he said, "but not everything I do is without cost." He let a beat pass. "I'm telling you now because the situation has changed. The LaCroix problem will be resolved, but it will require you to be more visible in certain ways. I won't put you in that position without you understanding what you're agreeing to." I looked at him for a long time. The window behind him showed a pale November sky, the city grey and close. "What happens to the organization if I leave?" I asked. "It continues," he said. "You'd be compensated. You'd be protected. I'd ensure that, and if I stay, then you stay as someone who has chosen to," he said, "not someone who was placed." The thing about Casimir Rhone, the thing I'd been trying not to look at directly for months, was that he meant what he said. He was meticulous and ruthless and operated in a world that ran entirely on leverage, and he was offering me the one thing that world almost never offered, an actual choice. I thought about the apartment in Parkdale, the basement windows, the quiet, the version of my life that had existed before. I thought about the kitchen in Brampton and my uncle's carefully folded hands and the number 47,000 and what it had cost me and what it hadn't. "I want it in writing," I said, "whatever the terms are going forward. Salary, scope, limitations. Written and signed." Something changed in his expression. Not quite a smile. Close to one. "That's fair," he said. "I know it is," I said. The LaCroix situation resolved over the following 3 weeks in ways I was only partially privy to. I knew from the accounts when it was finished. The cash reserves normalized. The unusual payments stopped. The structure of the books returned to something that looked, on paper, like a moderately aggressive real estate investment company. Whatever happened outside the numbers, I didn't ask about. That was still the protocol. I answered the questions that were mine. My uncle called in December. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was half apology and half deflection, the same register he'd been operating in for as long as I could remember. I listened to it once, deleted it, and made myself a coffee. I was sitting at the desk in my new office, on the 11th floor now, with a view that looked out over the lake, grey and enormous, the kind of view that makes the city feel both very large and very manageable, when Rhone appeared in the doorway. He had his coat on. He had 2 coffee cups. He set one on my desk without comment. I looked up from the account I was reviewing. The LaCroix network has restructured, he said. They've withdrawn from the Toronto operations entirely. I know, I said. I can see it in the numbers. He almost smiled again. He was getting better at it, or I was getting better at seeing it. There's a meeting in Vancouver in February. I'd like you there. To manage the accounts. To be at the table, he said. I looked at him for a moment. He looked back, patient, giving me the space to take it in. All right, I said. He nodded. He didn't leave. He leaned against the doorframe, coffee in hand, and looked at the window, at the lake, at the flat, grey November light pressing down on everything. You know what you are to this organization, he said, not quite a question. I'm starting to, I said. What were you to your uncle's household? I thought about it. A fix, I said, for problems he created. And here, I turned back to the account on my screen. $40 million moving through 4 shell structures, clean as water, every number in its correct place. Here, I said, I'm the one who decides what the numbers mean. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said, exactly that. I picked up the coffee he'd brought me. Outside, the lake was the color of iron, and the city was doing what cities do, moving, humming, generating and consuming in its enormous indifferent way, and I sat in the middle of it on the 11th floor, with a signed contract in the top drawer of my desk, and a name that no one in that building said without a particular kind of attention. I had walked in with a messenger bag, and the assumption that I had no options. I had learned, slowly, and then all at once, that the options had been there the whole time. I had simply needed someone to stop pretending otherwise. That was what Rhone gave me, in the end. Not shelter, not position, not even the truth of how I'd arrived, though he gave me that too. He gave me a choice, and meant it. And I had learned by then that a choice meant and kept is rarer than any number I had ever accounted for. I kept working. The lake didn't move. The city hummed. And somewhere below us, in the structure of a world that ran on leverage and silence, the books were clean, and they were mine.